Lisa with Real Property Management, talking about what a Phoenix landlord can do if their tenant doesn't pay rent. So everything I'm going to be talking about today is in line with the statutes and the rules and regulations here in the Phoenix metro area. So if you own rental property in other areas, be sure to check your local state regulations to make sure that you're in compliance. Here within the Metro Phoenix area, the most important thing a landlord can do in this process is to make sure that the lease agreement is very clear. So you want to make sure, obviously, you have a rent due date, very clear grace period, and then a very clear number in terms of the late fees and how the late fees are charged, and then who is going to pay for the legal notice, the rent demand notice, should the tenant not pay the rent. So at the end of your grace period, basically the morning of the day after the end of your grace period, is when you're going to want to get the tenant a rent demand notice, or what they call a pay or quit. And the way that works is if it is hand delivered to the tenant will have an additional 5 days to pay their full rent. If it is sent via certified mail, then the tenant has an additional 10 days to pay their rent in full. At the end of that time period, the landlord can then go to the court of your jurisdiction and file the paperwork for an eviction hearing. So it's very important that everything be lined up in your lease agreement so that there's no miscommunication about when you can serve that rent demand notice, because that really is what sets you up should you have to go the route of an eviction. With the eviction, the first step you'll have is a pretrial. So that's where you and your counsel, if you have counsel, and the tenant and their counsel, if they retained counsel, will go to the court or have a virtual court with the judge, basically to give a very brief overview of your case. And then at that point, the judge could decide to grant either side's the judgment, or they may set it for a full trial, in which case you'll actually then have a full trial where you'll be able to speak, the tenant can ask you questions, and vice versa. So it's really important also throughout this process to not take partial payments, because, for example, if let's just say your rent's due per your lease on the 1st, tenant has until the 3rd. So on the 4th, morning of the 4th, you serve that legal notice to your tenant. So if you do it certified mail, for example, then they would have an additional 10 days to pay. So your tenant may reach out to you during that time and try to give you a partial rent payment. The problem with that is, unless you have a full payment plan in place, if you accept that partial rent payment, you've basically waived your claim to the rest of the rent. So a lot of landlords will say, okay, well then I'll just do a payment plan. Well, here's the problem with the payment plan. So let's say you serve you serve the rent demand notice on the 4th. And at the end of the 10 days, the tenant says, well, I can pay half the rent now. So you're now at the 14th of the month. The tenant pays half the rent, and maybe they commit to pay the rest of the rent the 3rd or 4th week of the month. Well, before you know it, you're going to turn around and you're at the 1st again. So now a tenant who basically took the whole month to pay that month's rent, you're going to be right back in the same boat on the 1st, with them probably not having the funds then to pay rent. So we really suggest that you kind of nip it in the bud. And if you go to the end of the rent demand notice at the end of the 10 days, if the tenant can't pay that rent in full, or at the end of the 5 days if you hand serve it, we do recommend that you move forward with the eviction, because it's better to get that judgment and get possession back of the property, less time for the tenant to cause damages, and less time that you're going to be out of pocket for rent. So thanks very much for joining us, and join us next month.